It had become a game for survival of the fittest, and the group slowly turned against each other, each man for himself. Grass was becoming scarce, and their animals were steadily weakening. In an effort to relieve the animals' load, everyone was expected to walk. One traveler, Kiesbert, ejected Hardcoop, a 70-year-old man, from his wagon, telling him that he had to walk or die. He tried his best, but the last time he was seen alive a few days later was as he sat next to a stream, his feet so swollen they had split open. William Eddy pleaded with everyone to look for him, but they all refused, swearing they would waste no more resources on an old man. Humanity had died with Hardcoop's demise. A flicker of hope arrived when Stanton, who had left a month earlier to seek help in California, reappeared with reinforcements. He brought much-needed supplies, mules laden with food from Sutter's Ford, and introduced 2 Native American guides, known by their Catholic names, Louis and Salvador. Alongside the provisions, Stanton carried a vital piece of news. James Reed had successfully reached Sutter's Fort. For a moment, the weary travelers dared to hope. Even as the path ahead grew ever more uncertain, they pushed on over mountains that were described as much worse than the Wasatch Range. During this time, they lost one more family man to an accidental rifle shot, while another received a surface wound. They reached the base of the Sierra Nevada, the imposing structure the only obstacle between them and California. It was already late October, and winter had arrived. They followed the Truckee River, expecting to reach the pass that would take them into California's Central Valley. Regardless, snow had already started to fall on the peaks, a warning of the challenges ahead. The party set up camp near Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, situated about 6,000 feet above sea level. They planned to rest briefly before making their final ascent over the mountains. Snow wasn't expected till the middle of November, but this year, it came early. In the first weeks of November, a severe winter storm struck, leaving several feet of snow overnight, and the pass, now referred to as Donner Pass, became impassable. Wagons were covered under heavy snow, and the settlers' oxen either got stuck or froze to death. Struggles to move forward were hopeless, and the settlers soon realized they were trapped with no means of escape. The Donner Party prepared to endure the unforgiving winter. Their supplies, already stretched thin from weeks of rationing during the grueling trek through Utah and Nevada, had dwindled to almost nothing. Desperation forced them to build makeshift shelters from wagons and felled logs, but these crude structures offered little protection against the relentless cold. As the snow piled higher and temperatures plunged, starvation began to take hold, its grip tightening with each passing day. The snow persisted to fall relentlessly. Historical records demonstrate that the winter of 1846 to 1847 was among the harshest ever recorded, with snowdrifts soaring to 20 feet. The mighty peaks and thick forests of the Sierra Nevada tramped the group, making the search for food unthinkable. At first, the settlers carefully rationed their dwindling food supplies, hoping to stretch them through the harsh winter. But as the days wore on, desperation set in. They turned to slaughtering the oxen and horses that had accompanied them on their journey, consuming the meat in a grim effort to survive. Yet, even these resources quickly ran out. Scouring the snow-laden forest, they hunted for any sign of life: mice, squirrels, or really anything edible. Their searches yielded nothing but bitter disappointment. With no other options left, they resorted to boiling the hides of their oxen, reducing the tough leather into a foul, glue-like jelly that barely sustained them. They softened and ate strips of leather from belts, shoes, and even the covers of their wagons. Families scraped bark from the trees to chew on, and some even tried eating pine cones. Despite their efforts, starvation took hold, and with it came inhumanity. People became weak, unable to walk or even sit up, including the children who cried from great hunger, leaving their parents feeling helpless. Survival had become difficult to the extent that some of the settlers made the difficult decision to move to the other side of the mountains to look for help in California. The 15-person group set out on December 16, 1846, from the camp to cross the mountains. This group, which would be later known as the Forlorn Hope, consisted of William Eddy, one of the strongest men, and Mary Graves, who was only 20 years old at the time. They took the last of their food and fashioned snowshoes from ox hides to navigate the deep snow. The snowshoes offered some relief, but the struggle was far from over. The malnourished members, unaccustomed to enduring 12 feet of snow and frigid conditions, found their strength waning rapidly. By the third day, most had succumbed to snow blindness, their vision blurred by the relentless glare. On the morning of December 21st, the group pressed forward once again, but the punishing journey claimed yet another life. Stanton, who had been valiantly struggling to keep pace with the main group, stopped to rest, only to be left behind. He was never seen alive again. A year later, his remains were discovered at the very spot where exhaustion had overtaken him, a haunting reminder of the cost of survival. As starvation set in, confusion and delirium gripped the group, clouding their judgment and unraveling their resolve. After 2 more agonizing days without food, Patrick Dolan made a grim suggestion. One of them should sacrifice themselves to feed the rest. The grim proposal sparked desperate debate. Ideas ranged from duels to lotteries, each suggestion darker than the last. Others argued they should simply keep moving until someone collapsed from exhaustion. A horrifying, yet merciful alternative. But before they could decide, nature forced their hand. A sudden blizzard swept through, claiming the life of Antonio, the animal handler. Soon after, Franklin Graves succumbed to the cold and starvation, the group's fragile unity splintering further with each loss. The group was lost in the freezing outdoors for over a month, facing hunger and frostbite. They had to stop often because some were too weak to walk. Then, when all their food ran out and death seemed certain, they made a horrific decision. They had to eat the bodies of those who had died. As though driven mad by the relentless icy drifts, Dolan began to rant deliriously, stripped off his clothes, and ran into the woods. He returned shortly afterwards and died a few hours later. His death brought life to some of his companions as some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. Murphy Lemuel's sister tried to feed him some, but he died shortly afterwards. Eddie, Salvador, and Louis refused to eat. The next morning, the group stripped the muscles and organs from the bodies of Antonio, Dolan, Graves, and Murphy, their fallen comrades. They dried them to store for the days ahead, taking care to ensure nobody would have to eat his or her relatives. William Eddy later recounted on how they sliced the flesh into thin strips and dried it under the sun. Louis Kiesberg, a German immigrant, later confessed to consuming human flesh, a revelation that cemented his place as one of the most notorious figures in the tragedy. In later accounts, Kiesberg defended himself, saying, "I did what I had to do. It was that or die." 13-year-old Mary Murphy was another survivor who became an orphan after her parents lost their lives in the Sierra Nevada pass. Mary said she had tried to avoid eating human flesh but eventually gave in. Some of the group refused, even as they grew weaker, but most agreed, knowing it was their only chance to survive. Though their approach could be considered ruthless, it helped them survive. The forlorn hope finally reached a ranch close to the Sacramento Valley on January 17, 1847, from which only 7 of the 15 had made it out alive. The forlorn hope brought news of the Donner Party to settlers in California. Shocked and horrified, they organized a rescue party immediately. This group, led by James Reed, who had been banished earlier, left California in February of 1847. The first rescue team reached the camps on February 18, 1847. They were greeted with the shocking sight of pale, weak, and barely alive settlers. Some had frozen to death, while others were suffering from starvation. The rescuers called the shelters filthy, and the camp was surrounded by the stench of death. The settlers told the rescuers that they had eaten every animal, including their dogs, and boiled their leather goods to eat. Some of the survivors confessed to cannibalism, while others, including George Donner's wife, Tamsin, reportedly said she could not bear to eat human flesh, even though she was dying. The first rescue party to reach the stranded travelers brought a glimmer of hope, but it was fleeting. Their supplies were scarce, and the treacherous snow made the journey back nearly impossible. In the end, they could only take 23 survivors, most of them children, leaving behind food and a solemn promise to return. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue teams braved the mountains. Each expedition was met with relentless storms and snow so deep it slowed their progress to a crawl. When the second group finally arrived in early March, they were greeted by even more death. One of the survivors, Patrick Breen, made a journal of every one of his experiences, including the ruthless cold, the constant hunger, and the loss he suffered of his companions. As time passed, other people in the group became hopeless. They grew desperate and frustrated. Disease had ravaged the settlers, leaving many too weak to move, including their group captain, George Donner. A festering wound on his hand had turned gangrenous, confining him to his makeshift shelter. His wife, Tamsin, refused to abandon him, even as rescuers pleaded for her to save herself. By mid-April, when the last rescue team arrived, they discovered that only a few individuals were still alive. Tamsin Donner, unfortunately, had passed away, but an earlier group had rescued her children. By April of 1847, the tortuous saga of the Donner Party had ended. For months, 4 separate rescue teams braved the snow-covered mountains to rescue the survivors. In the end, only 48 of the 87 people who went on the trip survived. The survivors were transported to settlements in California, especially to Sutter's Fort, which was a major way station for travelers near what is now Sacramento. They were fed and attended to, but healing took time. Many survivors were severely malnourished, weak, and emotionally destroyed. Others were in dire physical condition, frostbitten or injured, and many carried the traumatic psychological scars. Most of them were children, as rescuers prioritized evacuating them when determining who to rescue. As news poured in about the party's nightmare, it shocked the entire nation. Survivors such as William Eddy, whose wife and children died, had absolutely no one in the world. Eddy would later say that the emotional pain of losing his family was worse than the physical pain he felt on the journey. He went on to become a vocal advocate for remembering the lessons of the Donner Party. He spent much of his life telling their story and warning others about the dangers of unprepared travel in the West. The Reed family, however, was among the luckier ones. James Reed, who had been banished earlier in the journey, had worked tirelessly to organize the rescue efforts. His wife, Margaret Reed, and their children all survived, making them one of the few families to stay intact. Most of the men in the group perished, as they often gave their food to the children or women, or exerted themselves more by hunting and building shelters. Women had a higher survival rate, partly because of their greater body fat percentage that helped sustain them during starvation, in addition to the reason mentioned just before. The Donner family in particular had faced immense suffering, with George and his wife Tamsin both dying. However, their children survived and were rescued in earlier missions. Most of the survivors, after being the victim of their ill fortune, attempted to rebuild their lives in California. Some of them successfully built a new life out of their experiences, while others struggled with the trauma and stigma of their experiences. The Breen family relocated to San Juan Bautista, California. They remained deeply religious and lived quietly, rarely discussing their time in the mountains. Patrick's journal, which he had maintained during the winter, became one of the most significant records of the Donner Party's experience. The Reed family started a new life in San Jose, California. James and his own flourished. The Reeds managed to avoid much of the scandals surrounding cannibalism, as they were among the few who did not eat human flesh during the ordeal. Mary Graves lost her parents and several siblings in the tragedy. Despite her trauma, she married and had children. She worked hard to create a stable life, but carried the emotional scars for the rest of her life. She was later quoted saying, "I would give everything I have to forget that winter." Louis Keseberg emerged as one of the most controversial survivors of the Donner Party. While he openly confessed to cannibalism, he faced far graver accusations, claims that he had murdered Tamsin Donner to consume her flesh. Though Keseberg vehemently denied these allegations, the damage was done. Shunned by society, Keseberg struggled to rebuild his life under the weight of public scorn and whispers that never truly faded. As the Donner Party's tale came to light, it created havoc in the United States. The details of the horrific accounts of starvation, death, and cannibalism filled newspapers and magazines. The fact that the settler families had resorted to eating human flesh frightened people throughout America. The survivors received mixed responses. Some were shown sympathy for for their suffering, while others faced suspicion or even revulsion, particularly those who had admitted to cannibalism. The Donner Party's story also served as the moral tale about the dangers and perils of westward migration. Lansford Hastings was held responsible for promoting the inaccurate Hastings cutoffs. His reputation also suffered, yet he persisted in promoting other ventures. Eventually, the Donner Party incident became a part of American history and folklore. Truckee Lake, later renamed Donner Lake, bears a large monument to the members of the party and their struggle and fight for survival. Historians and researchers have continued to investigate the Donner Party over the years, trying to understand the series of mistakes that sealed their tragic fate. A major lesson of their story is again the essential need for planning. The party had brought supplies that were insufficient, and they made bad choices, such as choosing the Hastings cutoff. Many survivors displayed incredible strength and a desire to live, even in the face of terrible conditions. While a real tragedy, it is also a tale of the resilience of the human spirit. Survivors like Mary Graves, William Eddy, and Margaret Reed rebuilt themselves and their lives after returning to their homes and after a traumatic, tragic loss. They survived what might be among the harshest conditions imaginable, the worst temperatures, starvation, isolation, and whatnot, but against all odds, almost half of them lived. Their story today stands as a memorable reminder of the sacrifices and fights endured by those pursuing a new life in the American West. Their names live on, not only as victims of a tragedy, but as abiding reminders of the resilience and resolve that helped shape a nation. The story of the Donner Party is one of survival, sacrifice, and moral dilemmas. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on Matt Pack.